So, as we all know, for this session, one of the last few for day one, we will be discussing about new media's role in policy communication. So, without further ado, let me introduce our call on stage, our speakers, starting off with Dr. Nuryanti Jali. Dr. Nuryanti Jali is an assistant professor of communication studies at the Northern State University in South Dakota. Originally from Malaysia, Dr. Jali received her PhD in mass communications from Ohio University in 2017. Her research interests include media and democracy, information disorders, media and information literacy, as well as which has a specific focus on Southeast Asia. Next on our panel, we have Professor Muneo Kaigo from the University of Tsukuba in Japan. Professor Kaigo is a professor of communication and media in the Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences. He is currently teaching in the Graduate School of Humanities and Social Sciences and the College of Comparative Culture at the University of Tsukuba. Dr. Kaigo is currently the Associate Dean of the Graduate School of Humanities and Social Sciences. Wow, quite a lot of achievements here, but basically, Dr. Kaigo previously led a joint research project on social media issues among local municipalities in Japan. And he is also the editor of Social Media and Civil Society in Japan by the Palgrave Macmillan. Last but most certainly not the least, we also have Dr. Kokil Jaidka. She is from the National University of Singapore. Dr. Jaidka is an assistant professor in computational communication, again at NUS. Her research interests lie in developing computational models of persuasive and argumentative language and building social media platforms that better facilitate constructive conversations. So, ladies and gentlemen, pleased to have you on the panel today. Let's start off with Dr. Jali's presentation.
Can I have the presentation up? Thank you so much for introducing me, and thank you so much for everyone for being here. This is Dr. Kokils. Okay, so now that is my presentation. So I feel that everybody is a little bit tired. We're at the end of the first day, and I want to present my topic today in a much informal kind of presentation. But at the same time, I really want to highlight on the influence of internet/new media in policy communication. So specifically, I want to address these questions: how has new media have been used to relay political messages to even the most disinterested citizens? So my presentation today will focus on Malaysian context because I am originally from Malaysia and how internet and new media has affected the way that we communicate policies. So let's go with my first point here. So as we all know that we live in a digital world, policy, communication, the way we communicate new policies, it's no longer one way, it's no longer unilateral, and it is more participatory, which means that if I upload something as a minister on social media, I can get immediate feedback. I can also learn about people's sentiment about that new policy. So this create a new dynamic between the government or people in power and the people that are affected by the new policy. So this is what we call it the good thing about new media, that you have voice as a citizen to kind of like give feedback to the government in a way that you can showcase how you feel about a policy that has been implemented. And another point that I really want to highlight is the fact that our life highly affected by social media, whether you want it or not. Maybe some of you do not have social media account, but most of us have social media account. If you ask me specifically, I have everything. I have Facebook, I have Twitter, I have TikTok, I have Instagram, you name it. I even have that new, what do we call that? Cloud Room or something, that one hit wonder, the social media platform podcast kind of thing. I also have that one. So here you can see that social media is highly pervasive in nature, which means that government or people in power, they can use this information and the fact that the availability of social media to help them strategically deliver new policies. So here is the new reality today. And government have to be more reactive and also understand the fact that there are tools to help them to get message across. However, social media should not be the only way for you to get that message across, because there are also people that are still disconnected. All right? So here, that's one thing. Policy communication is no longer one way. It's two ways now, even multiple ways, unlike before. So that's my first point. And the second thing that I really want to highlight also is the fact that tech affordances, availability of cheap mobile devices, and that allows people to have information like never before, and that information also include policies, right? So here in Malaysia, especially if we observe during COVID-19, the government tried to get latest updates to the people using multiple approaches, not just traditional media, but you can just go like on YouTube, you can go on Facebook, you can go like on Twitter to get latest updates about government policies. People are more connected, and sometimes even if you're that somebody that might not be as interested in policies, but your friends share a lot about this new policy, you might want to be, what we call it, you might want to say something about it. So that is one of the way that social media can help, what we call it, even like disinterested people to be exposed to policies. So people are more connected, allowing for political content to reach them in various ways. And here another thing is that people become, what we call it, political watchdogs, of course. Everyone has opinions. Everyone has opinions about something. So we are the media right now. We have access to smartphones, and we can create content, we can produce content, and these people with access to technology have that ability to become critics, to become journalists, to become political watchdogs. So that's my second point. And another point that I really want to talk about is that social media provide opportunity for the government to understand what we call it, how people react to what we call it, how people react to the policies, and also help what we call it, the government or people in power to understand people's values and expectations, right? And sometimes we do not really get this if we use like traditional way, one-way communication, if we go back to the traditional methods, but through social media, like I said at the beginning, our interaction with the new policies, what we call it, may provide additional chances and opportunity for you to get richer insight into people's values and expectations. So online behaviors can give policymakers the opportunity to further understand what people consider as important, and that can affect policy. So that's my next point. And additionally, social media content can provide timely information about the impact of policies. Here, I specifically put our Director General of Health, Dr. Noor Hisham, during the COVID-19. He's our hero at the time. Every day, like, we see his face across everywhere. If you go like on the radio, you can hear his voice. If you watch TV, you can see his face. And so he was that person that we listen to and pay attention to, especially when you are contained like in a very small space during the movement control orders, that we cannot move everywhere and we're exposed to what we call it information from the government. So using social media, people responsiveness and people reaction to these policies, and high responsiveness to public opinion by policymakers can can influence people's perceptions about policy making procedure. So here, high responsive to public opinion on policies can attract more involvement from the people to engage with policymakers. Because why? Because they know if they say something, it might influence the policy itself. So that is my next point. And my second last point, if you go and analyze social media connections, this is the kind of research that I'm into. What I'm doing is try to map out conversation. Policymakers can help identify where exactly conversations that might not be happening and why did it not happen, if you get what I'm saying. Why are we missing conversation in this segment of population? Did they not have that access to tools? If they did not get information, did not have access to tools to communicate with policymakers, they might not disinterested in policy, but highly likely because they do not have the tool to engage, right? So here, social media provide that opportunity, unlike traditional media. The network analysis provided that can reveal underserved populations who may be disconnected from public services. And finally, my final point, how internet, new media can help with policy communication. Internet platforms, of course, offer unique opportunities for policymakers to understand contemporary problems. If you know Malaysia, right now it's the monsoon season, and if we talk about flooding, there's always the political component to it. It's natural, natural disaster, but there's always a political element to it that are played by political actors. So here you can see that Malaysia, if you know, the past few days has dissolved its parliament, and one of the trending hashtag is Undi Banjir, which is a flood vote. It's literal, what we call translation. So here you can, if we go and investigate internet platforms, it offers unique opportunities for us to understand, like I said at the beginning, sentiment can also help understand and identify patterns, where exactly that people, actively engage in certain issues. So here in this example is on disease or disaster surveillance. And another thing that I really want to focus on is also the fact that social media provide real-time location information that can be used by policymakers to help with situational awareness and interventions for policy formations. And by looking at social media, early indications from social media about events or trends can also help policymakers to inform targeted and timely interventions, and perhaps to give government and also people in power ideas and how to, intervene, how to mitigate contemporary problems. So this is some of the ways that I believe new media can help with policy communication, and that's it for now.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Jolly. If you've been listening to her, she threw in a lot of practical tips for policymakers to enhance not only their followers, but their content as well. So let's entertain some questions later on. But for now, we move on to Professor Kaigo. Professor, the floor is yours.
Okay. Before I begin, my flight's going to go out in 7 hours. So before I forget, I want to really say thank you to Konrad Adenauer Stiftung and on behalf of all the speakers, allowing us this showcase. We're very grateful. And Glenn and I actually did a show in Yokohama in 2017, so I really know how tough this is organizing. It was a smaller scale, but I know how much work that has been put into this, so I really want to thank you again. For those of you who in the previous session I was in, I always start my talk with a cliche. Japanese people always apologize before a speech. And in the United States, you usually start with a joke. Unfortunately, all my jokes are really bad or dirty. So I'm sorry, I'm not going to make a joke. Okay. So today I'm going to talk about new media's role in policy communication from a Japanese perspective. So can we go to the next slide, please? Or how do I do this? Okay, all right. Okay, so this is the most recent United Nations e-government survey. You see Korea, Singapore, UAE, and then Japan. Surprisingly, Japan is ranked fairly high here, something which I don't understand, but it's data which is coming out from the UN, so I guess we should sort of share that. So putting the survey aside, to give you a glimpse into the problems that Japan has, there are many problems with implementing new media and policy communication. Really, I'm going to give you some of the manifest problems. For example, we have an aging society, 25% or more is over the age of 65, and they have very low digital skills, poor media literacy. Another manifest problem is the social cultural barriers that allow for, maintaining this above status quo among the aged over 65. And then our education system really has to improve. We still have a very dominant rote memory focused paper-based education up until high school. So basically, you do that for memorizing and then for entrance examinations, and that doesn't really help our students to learn how to use ICT in creative ways. So those are some of the problems that we have. To give you some, a glimpse into the barriers that we have for implementing new media. So we've had many initiatives. I'm not going to list all of them. We've had eJapan, which goes back about 20 years ago, and I probably talked about that during that time. Various ministries of education, the Somusho, they all try to enhance new media presence in the Japanese experience sort of poorly. And policy communication is fairly dominant, I think, in traditional media in Japan still. We look at what happens in the United States, we look at what happens in Europe, and then we try to sort of implement, I guess, what has happened there to the extent where it can work somehow. For some reason, Twitter is comparatively well used among a lot of the age groups in Japan. I think there's a reason, but to give you some data, this is fairly small, but if you look at some of the data that we have here, Twitter is the fairly dark gray area, usually at the bottom of the charts here. You can see that there are a lot of Twitter users in comparison to, for example, Facebook or Instagram. Line is sort of what is the equivalent of WhatsApp that you have here. So, most people use that. It's the most commonly used social media. So, because it's instant messaging, but for some reason, I think Twitter is the second largest, well-used social media. So there's a lot of penetration there. There are a lot of users there. Some of my former students have had 10 accounts, and some of them use it for private communication. Some of them lock it and they use it as a messaging system. So there are a lot of different accounts in Japan in Twitter, and then a lot of the politicians use the Twitter accounts. Our late Prime Minister Shinzo Abe had the most followers. Our current Prime Minister is not so popular, but that's life. So we have all the problems, you've probably heard of the filter bubble. And then we have, as we all know, bots. Bots are used everywhere. They used to attack anti-campaign messages, retweets, and bots can emulate human behavior. Bots can increase the flow of messages. And what happens in Japan, it takes, political communication. I was asked a question in the previous session about what is the role of political communication? So I was thinking that while I was having coffee, and because politics is sort of kind of like a belief system, it's best to explain, especially if it's in a democratic society. A democracy it takes time. It's an inefficient system. You can't have a quick decision, so it takes time. You have to let the people understand. Okay, we understand the problem, but there's processes that we have to take. It's going to take time, and don't be too discontent of what we do is probably the role that democracies have to take, because you have all these bots and you have all these people trying to manipulate the image of politicians. So a latent problem is the possible structural industrial problem in Japan. We don't have Google, we don't have Amazon, and we didn't have Facebook, and we don't have Apple either. Sony had a collaboration with them, but it didn't happen. So we don't have these ICT giants, and usually everything else comes back later on in life if you're in Japan. We have SoftBank, we have Yahoo Japan, and we have Rakuten, but SoftBank sort of wasn't able to get or materialize an alliance with Amazon, and all of these are sort of sidelined from the Keidanren. So the Keidanren is the corporate association in Japan. And we have IT organizations that started in 2015 and 16, and basically we want to I want to sort of explain that although it's fairly evident that Japan is lagging behind, there has to be some kind of structure that makes it difficult to create innovation and combinations in Japan, and I want to see if there's any possibility that we can sort of move forward with this. Fortunately, we have local governments which are more mobile rather than our central government. So we have initiatives such as the My City report. So these are sort of platforms where you can use devices, normal telephones, normal phones, and then this allows communication between citizens and city officials, and you can say, oh, there's illegal dumping of garbage over here, or there's another problem over here, and then you can have a discussion with the local government in the city. And there are a lot of open government initiatives, and these are unfolding in the local governments. Okay. We have another initiative here. This is sort of who to vote for. So we have different charts of different political parties, and if you have a belief in so and so, for example, climate change, and then don't vote for this party. So we have all these new sort of charts and information sources. Coming to the end of my talk, I wanted to plug some of the things that I'm doing. SDGs is also a belief system, and I'm trying to help people to organize efforts. And we also have a research team in development to look at inequality. So these are the things that I'm working at right now, and I'm basically out of time. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Kaigo. I'm quite interested to find out how important is it for policymakers to produce more visual, more shareable, and not so boring items in social media, but we'll get to that later on. So for now, for our last speaker for this panel, we have Dr. Jaidka. Go ahead.
Testing. Okay. So in Japan, as Professor Kaigo said, people start their talk with an apology. In India, we check to see who's in the room. So I want to talk about signals of policy in social media 2022. I'm going to start by giving a happy, joy set of results from my recent work, and then go on to the more serious implications of how policy is communicated. If I can get the slide to change. All right. I think I was already introduced, but this is broadly the umbrella under which I do research. And today, in today's agenda, I'll talk a little bit about my studies. Basically talking about policy communication through political messaging, its prevalence in digital public spheres and platform affordances, focusing mainly on the first and the last. So back in 2016, when I worked with my colleagues on some projects to do with social media and the use of social media in political campaigning in India, Pakistan, Malaysia, we found that political campaigns were being used by political parties to convey the issues of importance. And here's a cute word cloud about how one of the emerging parties, political parties at that time in India, was conveying both its issues and its focus of interest. As well as the information, as well as sharing information and interacting with their public, with their voter base. Nothing surprising here. But it's been 6 years since 2016, and political communication on social media has come a long way, even on the same platform, even on Twitter, which is what this study was about. More recently, and this is the Singaporean context that we're looking at, if we talk about Singapore, there's widespread internet access, 86% internet penetration in of a survey of 2014 people, and this is stats from the Reuters digital report. 73% consider social media to be their source of news, so it's a great way to communicate policy and directly to the public. But often the main problem is that these public have a low interest in digital and social media news. Hence the need to have direct policy communication from the government on social media. So my research on specifically the COVID lockdown and policy communication by the Singaporean government through Facebook during the COVID lockdown suggests that the main things that they discussed through their posts were to do with a lot of text here. I'm just going to talk about the main point, which is that the main themes were local updates, COVID-19 information, news and information seeking, and a little bit about daily life and feelings. What was interesting is that when the government put out policy communication on Facebook, it also, Granger, caused a change in Singapore's public's expressions of trust, so I'm going to read what's on the slide. It says, days with more official posts dispelling and issuing advisories were also points of high trust. The Granger causality relationship was significant and bidirectional. But when this information came from sources other than the government, the relationship was not significant, which suggests that the government did play an important role in policy communication, especially at a time of crisis during the COVID-19 pandemic, which is, of course, totally over. But that's the happy, joy part. Briefly about the digital public spheres that emerge online. They are not always cohesive. Not everybody talks to everybody else. And we have a tendency to choose homophilous communities based on even the language that we speak. This is an aspect of literature which is absent from the current Western interpretation of echo chambers, but is very much something that needs to be considered in the Asian context. But increasingly in my recent work, what I observed was that there are different design aspects of these platforms which might change the way people talk on them and which might change whether or not these deliberative public spheres can exist. Broadly, I was looking at how there are different norms on platforms, which is the paper on the extreme right. There are different ways to project yourself as anonymous or de-anonymous. And even the amount that you're allowed to speak in a single post, and that's specifically about Twitter, that can change the quality of the discussions you can have, specifically the quality of political discussions. That's why I got interested in understanding what actually determines these platform design features. And the research here is under the broad area of platform governance, which suggests that the distribution and visibility of social media posts are governed by a complex set of rules and norms instituted by coordinating and often competing stakeholders who operate under the hood of these platforms. Broadly, what this means is that what you see on your social media feed is a result of a negotiation between tech companies, advertisers, and governments. Tech companies, advertisers, and governments. Policy communication is not as simple as spreading information or putting out advisories about COVID, but there are other subversive or indirect ways in which policy can be communicated. The new signals of policy often come about through what is permissible to be said and what is permissible in a so-called deliberative public sphere. Three aspects of this, of these policies that I've been reading about, and one of them that I've been exploring is what I'm going to talk about next. Governments have the leeway through social media platforms to control what makes it to the social media feed of their countries. This is research which looked at what were the hashtags being withheld in different countries across the world. What you see on the screen is, on the first column, the country. And in the next column, you see the hashtags that were withheld. So any tweets which had those hashtags were likely to be withheld in those countries. The next column says what Twitter accounts were not allowed to be mentioned, and the final column says what URLs. What this suggests is that policy communication can be an indirect method through what information is withheld from the public sphere. To be clear, that's not my research. This is research about different countries in the world and how they're doing their policy communication from researchers everywhere. The next way in which this is done is also through censorship. This is research from France, Germany, and UK. Before the elections, a number of accounts were suspended and then their content was analyzed. I know the text is really small, but it mainly says what we saw in the previous slide, which is that information coming from certain URLs usually predicted a ban on those accounts. Those accounts were suspended and no longer allowed to share any information. And finally, shadow banning. Shadow banning is a temporary act. It's the subject of my latest paper, and that's what got me interested in platform governance in the first place. What my research is suggesting is that consistently, persistently, over time, platforms, either because they want to protect their monetary interests or their political interests, have the ability to control and temporarily clamp down on discussions to do with certain topics. These topics are often political or social. A lot of the research in this area is unfortunately anecdotal. A lot of speculation around this area because these actions are often temporary. Twitter now admits to instituting shadow bans, but they don't notify users when these are instituted, which means that there is lack of accountability. If accounts are thus shadow banned, they are not allowed to talk about certain topics. On the right, you see evidence from, so these are topics from the US, and this is evidence from the US, which shows that for different model specifications, shadow bans continued to be found in a variety of models that were tested. What would be interesting would be to see if the same findings remain for other countries, all the other countries that we talked about in the other slides, and to see if there is anything interesting to be understood about policy communication in a so-called restrictive rather than deliberative public sphere. So the implications of this research and of new kinds of policy communication are many. First of all, these effects might be minimal, but they're incremental and gradual. and they will slowly turn into users conforming to the norms that they observe on social media. Spirals of self-censorship and political attitude formation with a majoritarian perspective are to be expected. Similarly, in the discourse and finally in the governance, what seems to be happening is the policies are instituted to replicate offline realities in online spaces. That's been my time. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Jaidka. Again, a round of applause for our panelists. Just to get a context of how our discussion would be like, may we get a show of hands of how many are policymakers or political staff who are here in the room? Okay, so we have 3, 4, 5. How about journalists? Okay, okay, we also have a few journalists here and then members of the academe. Okay, also a few. So you more or less get an idea of what kinds of questions will be thrown your way later on. But before we move on to the question and answer part, let's first ask the most important question, regardless if you're a politician, you're a journalist, a celebrity, or whatnot. When it comes to social media, the thing is, you have a lot of content there. You also have a lot of competitors in terms of content providers. So what can policymakers or journalists do in order to grab the attention of their audience on social media, considering that social media audiences tend to be so fickle-minded and tend to easily switch tabs or scroll up their feeds?
Right. So I had like almost a similar question from my previous session, and in that session I talked a little bit more in depth on online disinformation and how exactly, like in that context, I was focusing on journalists, and in this context, I want to focus on policymakers. So here, first thing first, as what we call it, media scholars, and the key here when it comes to how can you get people's attention on social media, because you have a lot of contenders, like you said, and especially when we have to deliver pretty much boring stuff compared to other things, and how do we get like people's attentions on social media? So here, first thing first, we have to understand how exactly that people consume information these days, right? So if we talk about policymakers, if I give like in the context of Malaysia, Malaysia has seen drastic improvement in terms of how they, what we call it, government deliver informations and how they present informations. Before it was like pretty much not as attractive as other media producers, but now they understand if they do not catch up, do not present information interactive enough, people will not want to pay attention. So if you see in the case of Malaysia, like I said at the beginning of my presentation, government specifically are trying to reach out to people through various channels. If we talk about like TikTok, I live in the US. This is the exact example I give in the other room. I live in the US, but I still get my information live on time on my TikTok in the US because Malaysian government, or perhaps what we call it, news agencies are broadcasting this across all these media channels because they know that people don't really watch TV anymore. And there are a lot of Malaysian diasporas outside. And hey, we are competing with other people, like you said, information, and plus we do not want them to get information from elsewhere, and therefore we have to understand how people consume information. Now, social media, people want live, should not be what we call it, gatekeep in terms of like policies or news from main media agencies. They use social media, and also we have to understand how people like to consume bite-sized information. And here, policymakers have to think about, hey, data visualizations, policy presentation. We do not want to make it long-winded speech. Instead, cut it short, make it into short pieces, short bites, and people are willing to consume this if it's short. So here is like, that's my take on this, because I feel that based on my research, based on my observation, if it's too long, if it's not attractive enough, people will not want to pay attention to what you say.
Yes, because since they have so many options, they tend to literally just scroll through their feed. Anything to add on that point, Professor Kaigo and Dr. Jaidka?
Can I go? Yeah. I can only talk from a Japanese perspective again. In my interactions with policymakers, for example, people who have actually been in the cabinet, for example, and in comparison with the way that the media portrays them, traditional media and elsewhere, and my personal interactions, to be honest, when I actually talk with them, they are basically some of the nicest people that you've ever met. They're very charismatic. They have a lot of charisma, very kind, very polite, very humble. But the media doesn't really want to portray that. So I think in Japan, if you're in the opposition party, for example, if you're not in the ruling faction, for example, that is the only time you want to have coverage by the media. That is the only time you want to have people follow you on social media. Other than that, in the cultural context of Japan, you want to be invisible. Okay, so if people don't notice you, people don't notice that you're slacking off or you're sleeping during the parliament debates, or which happens a lot in Japan if you pay attention to the television reports. If you look carefully enough, you'll see people doing this, resembling something which very much looks like sleep, okay? Not all of them, but some of them actually do that. And getting to my point is, if you're under some stress where you have to present whatever kind of information you need as a policymaker, in Japan it is not openly said, but we have a lot of media corporations that help script their speeches. We have a lot of them that sort of try to help them devise how to reach out to the public. And these often happen most during elections. So during election times, media corporation the colleagues that I know or the friends that I know who work in the big media corporations, I have to go to Niigata for the next couple of weeks because we're having an election, or I have to go to this prefecture. And all the people who live in Tokyo, they have to go out to some other prefecture to sort of work on the elections. So that's how it is in Japan. When you have an election, that's when you want to have equal or more attention from the public so that you get elected. But other than that, you don't really want them to know what exact policy you have.
Quite an interesting insight, because in the Philippines, it's the other way around. You have to stay on the national consciousness for you to get elected. Okay, Dr. Jaidka?
Thanks. I'm not sure I agree with Professor Kaigo, but I do have something to add to the perspective, which is, yes, what Professor Kaigo is suggesting perhaps is that the public conscience or the public eye may not be that important. Or it's subversive to to the interests of the ruling parties. What I also want to point to is that we are no longer the same internet and the same social media that we were 5 years ago. And that's what I tried to convey through my presentation as well. Not only has who's talking on the internet and who's talking on social media changed, but also what people come to social media for. So for a policymaker or for a journalist who is looking to make their audience, they will have to make their audience. Broadcasting does not seem to be the modus, the mode for the youngest generation of social media users to get the information. Increasingly, people are turning into more private circles where if journalists and policymakers want to want to build a community, they have to find other ways of getting to do so. And focusing on large numbers or broadcasting may not even be the way forward. So engagement might look very different in the new social media.
I understand that point. So let me just bring you back to the Philippines, because in the Philippines, our newly elected president, Bongbong Marcos, has been using new media very much these days. He basically conveys all his policies via his vlog. He has a dedicated YouTube channel named after himself. And instead of releasing press releases to the media, he just uploads everything on YouTube, on Facebook, and even on Instagram stories. Now, my question for you three would be, is this an effective strategy to sort of celebrify, if that's a term? Does this create more boons or more banes for a politician to create certain blogs to make them seem more like the masses?
I can answer that question. I think it's mostly influenced by what kind of landscape that you're in, what kind of culture that you're in. You get what I'm saying? Like, if we're talking about Japanese culture, it might not, the same as how we do things in Malaysia, how we do things in the Philippines.
That's right. It's like traditional media where you need to know your audience first.
Right.
Before devising a strategy on how to lure them into your channel or your feed.
Right. If you can see, if you talk about Bongbong Marcos, because I also observe him on TikTok. So he had a lot of followers on TikTok, and he strategically used the new platform on top of other platforms that we all know to kind of like influence how people see the Marcos family, of course. And then, the reality is his victory proves something, which means that it works, in the Philippines and also in Malaysia by we call it popularizing yourself through social media. It works because people have that assumption, hey, you work, you're doing something, because, hey, you keep on telling us that you're doing something. So that is how, the dynamic, how politics is, at least in my home country, like I said, I cannot say for other places, but in my home country, that works as well. So here, if you say that, hey, if politicians use social media to kind of use it to kind of highlight on themselves and what they do and the policy, will it work? Historically, it has worked, at least in multiple instances.
Yeah, I agree. Absolutely. I think it works. And like I said, I think it works because even platforms have a stake in making it work. Things are not mutually exclusive. Another thing is that we know for a fact that these political campaigns spend a lot of time understanding the audiences and why their target audience is using social media in the first place. And this is something that can be done with good intentions and something that can be done to engage such an audience. Speaking from a news perspective, for instance, BBC put in a lot of research into building a content feed on Instagram that's tailored to educating people, inspiring people, and being able to tell them the boring stuff, but in an interesting manner. And I found that really interesting, and definitely, I'm sure something that other people also consider their playbook.
Yeah. As most of you know, it's fairly easy to use APIs to collect a lot of data from social media. You just need a little bit of knowledge in coding, and then you can collect all the tweets regarding a certain phrase or a certain hashtag. Once you aggregate that, then you can sort of probably measure the sentiment towards a certain policymaker, and then you can divide it if it's negative or positive. It's fairly routine. It's not too difficult. And if you can exploit that, you can sort of manipulate your followership, should I say. That has a very bad ring. How should I say? Your fan base. So if you can manipulate your fan base by using that, by correctly analyzing what kind of sentiment is being tweeted around a certain for example, statement made by a certain policymaker, then you can sort of be reassured that you can have or be re-elected because you won't lose so much of your popularity. Okay, but not all. I think not all policymakers use that, but I think it's fairly routine with especially the people who are in power right now. So and that's why they want to use Twitter, because it's so easy to analyze, and it's also very easy for the media corporations to sort of get that data and then reanalyze and get a better perspective on, okay, so how should we introduce this idea? Is this unpopular? For example, we have a debate on nuclear power, so and it's not a popular option at the moment, but a lot of policymakers want to see what direction that is going in. So there's a lot of measurement going on. There's a lot of ideas on how to gauge the public sentiment about a certain policy. Yeah.
Yeah, so I agree that you have to understand how the algorithm of a certain platform, of a certain social media platform, works first before you can, what's the word, Professor Kaigo? Before you can manipulate your fan base. Let's open the floor to questions. Go ahead.
Simon from the Liberal Party in Australia. I once had a taxi driver in Sydney who encountered a bit of road rage, and he made what I thought was a profound observation. He said, Australians are really nice people, except when they're behind the steering wheel or behind the keyboard. And we've got a lot of problems with young people being bullied mercilessly on social media platforms, and in politics, it's just, I'm from the centre-right party. Our people are terribly polite. But the left are it's just standard operating procedure that when anyone from us stands for Parliament, they just have a bunch of people sitting behind the keyboard, just hurling abuse, just a torrent of it. Facebook doesn't seem to be as bad because there's more normal people there. It's harder to set up fake accounts and put your name to it. Twitter is just a cesspit. It's a sewer, all right? To the point where we say to most candidates, it's only the diehards that are on there. You go there, you're just going to find yourself being hurled abuse or engaging in arguments with complete idiots. Don't bother, except for the senior members of the team. My question is, I guess, is this something unique to us, and that sort of the Asian culture is different, where there's the concept of face or something kicks in and you don't have this problem? Or is it a problem and has it been dealt with culturally or legislatively? And what would be the problem, either legally, practically, or morally, for all of you as academics, with either the companies themselves or governments requiring of them to set up a system whereby you join this platform, you're required to put in your details and verify your identity, so that if you ever want to be sued for defamation, we can find you. But in the act of doing that, you've got to present your real person there. So unlike Twitter, where you can't just set up accounts saying, I hate so-and-so, and just, you've got to actually present your true self, so that just as if you go into the town square, you can't just shout like an idiot because you look like an idiot. So it is with the virtual town square, and if you've got something to say, you have to put your real name behind it, stand by it, and clean it up that way. And if you want to be an idiot, that's your problem, but you can't hide behind the screen to do it. So A, is it a problem, what I've described in your cultures, and how have you gotten around it? And B, what would be wrong with that solution were anyone to adopt it?
Anyone from the panel?
Yeah, sure. I agree, it's accessible. In Japan, if the tweet, for example, if it's only within Twitter, and if the tweet is of criminal nature, then that allows the NPA, the National Police Agency, to conduct an investigation and find out the IP of whoever wrote this and determine who did this. And if through repeat offense, they're able to locate the person who made criminal tweets. For example, I'm so pissed off at so-and-so policymaker, I'm gonna assassinate him tomorrow. is, that's considered a criminal act in Japan. So those are the times when the police agency can move in. The question you also posed relates to, for example, Jürgen Habermas's public sphere, where it's an ideal that we have. Unfortunately, Twitter, as you mentioned, is a cesspool. But in Japan, at least, there is a sense of where you are not supposed to really reveal your political identity. For example, your political belief is sort of very, very prevalent in Japanese society. So, with that said, you want, for example, if you want people's honest opinions, it has to be anonymous, is the sort of real sentiment among the people who continue writing in Twitter and sort of like, commenting on Twitter. And that's why the platform still exists. In Japan, it's not the most reliable platform, I also agree, but you're able to gauge some of the sentiment and some of the honest opinions, which is very difficult to collect through polling and surveys. I hope that answers what you addressed. Well, it's only from my perspective.
From Malaysia?
Maybe I want to add a little bit on that. The first question or statement of what you asked, is it the same in Asian culture? It is, at least in my country, that, people just go anonymous. And then if you were in the session where Professor Chirin George presented his talk, he suggests this idea that people have to, multiple identities, online and offline. And in Malaysia, offline, anonymous, maybe not so much on Facebook, because like you said, Facebook is we have more real people because active identification of fake accounts. Not so much on Twitter, not so much on TikTok. So there you can see that a lot of comments, hurtful comments, hate speech going on in the comment sections. And as an observer, I feel that, whatever happened to, to politics in Australia, it's also the same thing that I observe in my home country. And if you ask, should tech companies, require for people to register their real name, I feel like, at least where I'm from, Malaysia, it can make people stop giving you honest opinion about how they feel. Because why the anonymity of internet? I know it sounds cliche. It makes somebody, people have that bravery to say something to politicians. But if they know, even if they do not do anything, if they know that one time if they say something wrong, especially in a weak democracies. If you're talking about weak democracies, you can observe several countries, pseudo-democracies, they know that if they say something, something will happen to them. So which means that before that happens, let's not just say something. So here, it's a difficult question. And as a policymaker, as people in power, it's something that, you have to kind of delve deeper into. I do not have absolute answer to that, but at least based on my opinion, that is not the way to go based on my home country context, Malaysia, because people will not say much after if that's implemented.
Dr. Jaidka.
Thank you for those perspectives. I think the answers that we're getting are related to surveillance and basically about anonymity and the importance of an anonymous point of view. But there can be some very serious consequences as well if everybody were to reveal their identities beyond being able to get frank opinions. The problem that you've discussed, where it seems like supporters of a certain political party go online and spew abuses. This is been observed in many different contexts worldwide. One of the terms by which it is known is astroturfing. And there has been policies put in place to at least control hate speech. I can speak from the perspective of Singapore and India. In Singapore, there is a POFMA, which is instituted to make sure that to control the spread of falsehoods and hate speech, and it's implemented pretty seriously. It's at least from my understanding, it has been activated as well to clamp down on hate speech and on misinformation. In India, what has happened is that I would say the moderation is skewed. There is a lot of hate speech online, especially on Twitter, and that has changed the nature of the public sphere on Twitter. Twitter was important in India's consciousness to rise up and mobilize on different social issues, but that was back in 2013. The importance of Twitter in India's deliberative sphere seems to have changed completely. It's become more of a tool for political propaganda rather than anything else. And when people are not anonymous and when they speak from their own account, their lives are often in danger. Some of them have lost their lives. Some of them are arrested. A lot of them are arrested and detained for long periods of time. So there are very serious consequences to revealing identities when speaking truth to power.
Okay, based on their answers, I think the fear of backlash cuts across all ethnicities here. Any other questions from the floor? One more, go ahead, please.
Hi, my name is Baizura. I'm coming from Malaysian National News Agency. The question that I want to ask is that Bernama is wire services that is currently moving towards becoming a content creator. But our challenges is lack of funding, as Bernama is a government affiliated agencies. So what we have to do now is reporters, journalists and photographers are doing multitasking jobs, taking pictures and videos and everything, and we have to serve across many social platforms. And my question is, since Dr. No is studying on, doing research on social media, if you were to choose one or two, if you want to focus on one or two digital content, which social media account that actually appeals more targeted and can gain more traction? It's just that because sometimes when we go out for assignment, we came up with content, but it is not appeal for, it is not suitable for all social platform. So sometimes we have to be more focused. So for example, for the coming election, which social media accounts do you think can appeal more and we can focus on? Sorry.
Thank you so much for that question. I think it's a relevant question because I have a lot of journalist friends. And here I do not have like absolute answer for you because in Malaysia we have different group using different social media. So you kind of need to identify your main targets. If you're talking about old people like me, I'm on Facebook. And if you're talking about young people, they're on like TikTok. If you're talking about like, you know, politically engaged millennials, they're on Twitter. So you have to kind of like identify, you know, who exactly that your target market. If you talk about Instagram, Instagram might not have as much impact when it comes to political content, at least in Malaysia, based on my observation, because Facebook play what we call it a bigger role in that sense, and also Twitter. And now, but we have emerging. I would say emerging, but it's one of the top platforms, TikTok. So you might want to, you know, track and get more data on who are the people that are using this and whether or not these people are the people that you want to get your information to. So I cannot choose for you, so you know your target. And then like you said, sometimes as a journalist, you have to pick and choose due to your budget, but I really hope that you get your budget because we need to get the information across as much as we can. Otherwise, a certain segment of our population will be excluded from getting that information.
Great sense of the time. Any more questions? All right, we finished on time, and that ends day one of the conference. Thank you so much for attending. See you tomorrow again. Don't forget to use the hashtag ACPC22 on your social media posts. Thank you again, and see you later.